A hard-working father spends years building up his small business to provide for his wife and young children. When he fails to open up his store one morning, his family members go to his house and discover his whole family brutally murdered in cold blood. As news of this massacre spreads across Australia, pressure mounts on police to hunt down the killer and find out what compelled him to commit this egregious act. This is the story of the Lin family. Min Lin met his future wife Lily in the 1990s. They were both students from China who were studying abroad in Sydney, Australia. There was an immediate attraction between them, and they became close with one another. Their relationship evolved into a romantic one, and after finishing school, the couple decided to stay in Australia, where they'd eventually raise a family together. They settled in North Epping, a quiet suburban area in northern Sydney, and by 2009, Min and Lily were married and had 3 children. Their oldest was 15-year-old Brenda. She was a smart student who took a strong interest in her education and had many friends at her school. Min and Lily also had 2 younger boys, 12-year-old Henry and 9-year-old Terry. Henry was a badminton player who practiced almost every day for his competitions and won many tournaments. He was dedicated and had ambitions to one day represent Australia in badminton. Terry followed in Henry's footsteps and started joining him during his practice. Min opened up a small business called North Epping News Agency, which sold newspapers, magazines, and school supplies, among other things. The business took many years of tireless effort to build up and make successful, and by 2009, Min's hard work had paid off. The news agency was thriving and had become a staple in the North Epping community with many regular customers. Min was able to afford his family a house worth over $1.2 million and bought his parents, Yang Fei Lin and Feng Quin Zhu, their own home and paid for all of their expenses. Min also took care of his wife's sister Irene by letting her have her own room in his house and paying her to work part-time at the news agency. Min even helped his sister Kathy and her husband Robert Z when they were facing hard times. Robert was an ear, nose, and throat doctor from China who later migrated to Melbourne, a different city in Australia where he opened a restaurant. After the restaurant eventually failed, Min helped Kathy and Robert move to Sydney, where they found a home just around the corner from his house. He also hired Kathy at the news agency until she and Robert could get back on their feet. Kathy and Robert were close with the rest of the family and had a close bond with Min and Lily's children. Robert regularly spent time with Henry and Terry and would coach them both in badminton on weekends. The whole family was very tight-knit and would all gather at least once a week. Min was a provider from humble beginnings who did whatever he needed to do to make sure his family stayed close together and were taken care of. He worked very hard for many years in order to provide them with a happy and healthy life. Unfortunately, this would all come to an abrupt end in 2009 after a gruesome tragedy that would forever damage the Lin family and leave residents of North Epping terrified for years to come. July 17, 2009 was just like any other Friday for the Lin family. It was dinner at Min's parents' house that evening, and everyone was expected to be there, except for Brenda. She was away that week on a school trip with her French class in New Caledonia, a small French island located 750 miles east of Australia. After Henry and Terry returned home from school and Min finished work that evening, the family left and took the half-hour trip to Min's parents' house, where Kathy and Robert were already waiting for them. As usual, dinner was served and everyone shared how their week went. 12-year-old Henry was happy to announce that he'd just won another badminton tournament. He was so proud as everyone congratulated him, but nobody was more proud of him than his grandmother, Feng Quin Zhu. This news made her so happy that she gave him $50 as a reward and asked him to stay over that night. Henry politely declined and told his grandmother that he already made plans with his uncle Robert to practice badminton the next day. Just after dinner, Min had excused himself as he had to get back to work. He needed to deliver newspapers to a few of his customers before the end of the night and left his parents' house at around 9 p.m. He planned to meet his wife Lily along with her sister Irene and the kids back home after finishing his deliveries. At 9:45 p.m., Min was captured on a surveillance camera making one of his last deliveries for the night at a gas station near his house. This image would turn out to be the last time that Min or any of his family members home with him that night were known to be alive. In the early hours of the following morning, a few of Min's regular customers arrived at the news agency and immediately sensed that something wasn't quite right. The gates were still closed, and bundles of newspapers were piling up outside the store. Min never opened up late, let alone on a very busy Saturday morning. A small crowd formed outside the store as customers waited for someone to open up any minute. When it wasn't looking like anyone was coming anytime soon, one customer became concerned and rang Kathy's phone to make sure that everything was okay. Kathy tried reaching out to her brother, and when he didn't respond to her, she decided to take the 5-minute walk to his house with her husband and check up on him. Kathy and Robert knocked on the door and rang the bell, but nobody answered. When they reached for the doorknob, they found it unlocked. They both walked in as they announced themselves. At first, everything seemed to be in order, and the house looked the same as it usually did. But as they made their way inside, they started noticing that something wasn't right. All the lights in the house were off, and it was oddly quiet. They called out for Min and Lily, but nobody answered. After walking through the first floor, they found it completely empty and decided to make their way upstairs. They tried turning on the lights, but none of them would turn on. The first room they went to upstairs was the master bedroom, where Min and Lily slept. As soon as they walked inside, Kathy and Robert realized that they had just walked into the scene of a murder.
Hello, I need an ambulance to 55A Boundary Road.
What's wrong? What's wrong?
Someone's to be killed.
Is someone bleeding? Is someone unconscious?
I think so they died.
Why? Why?
I'm not sure, but maybe someone killed my brother's family.
Why do you think that?
I need someone to come quick.
We are coming. You need to stop screaming and tell me what the problem is.
Yeah, I think someone killed my brother's family.
Are they on the ground?
No, they are in the bedroom. They're all in the bedroom. Just quick.
We are driving there. Don't say quick. Tell me what's wrong. Have you seen your brother?
I'm not sure.
No, it's yes or no. Have you seen him in the house?
I didn't see him.
But why do you think he's dead? I'm a bit confused.
Because I saw my brother's sister-in-law, the body, and I saw the sister-in-law sister's body, and I saw the two cousins, to my brother's son's body. So I thought, I didn't see my brother.
Can you see their bodies?
Yeah, I saw.
Laying on the bed in the master bedroom was an obviously deceased body with large amounts of blood splattered across every part of the room. The person's head was so badly disfigured that it wasn't immediately clear who it was, though Kathy instinctively knew that it was Lily and quickly found herself in a state of panic and intense fear. Kathy and Robert ran over to Irene's room and found a similar scene. Irene's face was also unrecognizable, and her limp body was slumped up against a wall with blood everywhere. In the boys' room, they found Henry and Terry also violently murdered, but Min was nowhere in sight. Police arrived shortly after Kathy called them and found her standing outside, screaming desperately for help. The crime scene was immediately closed off as detectives got to work and began their investigation. It was first suspected that Min could have been responsible for this, but police found his body on his bed right next to Lily, completely covered with a blanket. The scene was gruesome. Blood was everywhere. Bone fragments and brain matter littered the surfaces of the floor, walls, and ceiling of each room. At first glance, it appeared to police that each victim took a shotgun blast to the head. It wasn't until the bodies were transported to a medical examiner for autopsies that it was determined that they were all actually bludgeoned to death with blows to their heads using a heavy blunt object. They were so badly beaten to the point where they all were beyond recognition, and some of them couldn't even be identified for certain until forensic testing was done. The medical examiner concluded that all but one of the victims had died almost immediately after being struck in the head. 9-year-old Terry fought for his life as he was struck 6 times in his head and stayed alive for up to 2 hours after his attack. This wasn't just a homicide case. It was a crime of the most savage nature that left an entire family brutally murdered inside their own home in the middle of the night. News of this spread rapidly throughout North Epping and quickly made national headlines across Australia. 15-year-old Brenda had absolutely no idea that her whole family had been murdered until a news article made its way into her Facebook messages. A friend of hers saw the news and shared it with her, asking if she was okay. Brenda saw a picture of her house surrounded by crime scene tape and a team of police officers, and was in a state of complete shock as she boarded the first available flight back home. She later said that she didn't grasp the reality of the situation until she landed back in Australia and saw the grief-stricken face of her Aunt Kathy, who hugged her tightly as she wept uncontrollably. That's when Brenda realized that she was never going to see her family ever again. Kathy and Robert took her home with them while police investigated the crime scene back at her house. A funeral for the Lin family was held on August 8th, and hundreds of people attended. Emotions were hard to contain as attendees watched 5 coffins being slowly carried inside the Badgery Pavilion, while 15-year-old Brenda sat there and wept. All 5 bodies were taken to Macquarie Park Cemetery, where Min, Lily, Henry, and Terry were buried, and Irene was cremated. As news of this tragedy spread throughout Australia, residents of New South Wales were outraged and terrified, knowing that a savage murderer was freely walking around amongst them. Police were under a tremendous amount of pressure to figure out who had committed this atrocious act, and a task force was quickly assembled. Strike Force Noburn was now underway and in full swing, working around the clock to get to the bottom of this heinous crime. Kathy and Robert met with the press, thanking their community for their support and pleading for the public's help in finding out who did this to their family.
At this moment, I don't know how to say, but I feel everyone support us and care us and love us. I want to say thank you very much.
Need more information, even very small clue to help them to solve the case. If anyone can help, please contact the police.
The police investigation uncovered clues which led to a few significant conclusions. 1. There was likely one attacker. 24 footprints were found inside the house, which were all from the same pair of sneakers, a pair of Asics between size 8.5 and 10.5. 2. The attack was planned. Not a single fingerprint belonging to anyone outside of the family was found at the scene, indicating that the attacker likely wore gloves. This was also supported by the way the blood was smeared on the walls and other surfaces. 3. This was a targeted assassination. The house was not ransacked, and nothing seemed to be missing or out of place. This ruled out the possibility of a burglary gone wrong or a crime of opportunity. Whoever did this came in, murdered the family, then immediately fled the scene. And finally, whoever had done this had to have been close with the family. The power to the house was cut from the outside, after which the attacker entered the house without having to break in, and in pitch black darkness, quietly made his way up the stairs and straight into the master bedroom where he bludgeoned Min and Lily in their sleep. This was determined due to the lack of any defensive wounds on either of their bodies. Irene and the boys, however, did have defensive wounds, as they were believed to have been woken up by the noise and tried to resist the attacker. The most remarkable detail, however, was that all of the bedroom doors were covered in blood, except for one, the one that belonged to 15-year-old Brenda's room. Not only was the killer able to walk right into the house and navigate it in total darkness without making a sound, but it seemed that they knew Brenda wouldn't be home and didn't even bother checking her room. Detectives shifted their focus to one person, Robert Z. Both Robert and his wife Kathy were brought in for questioning.
My sister-in-law lying, maybe part of bodies out of bed, and also the beside that one is, I think it's maybe my brother, but I can't see any hand, leg, or head or any part of my brother's body.
Try to stop Kathy to look at this thing. I don't want Kathy to look at things. Yeah, that's what I want.
Why was that?
Scary. It was scary.
Robert tells police that after having dinner at his in-laws' house the night before the murders, he and Kathy went home together and he watched TV for a few hours. then took a bath at around 2 a.m. before going to bed with his wife. Kathy corroborated Robert's account and said that he was with her the whole time until they discovered the murder scene the following morning. Police, however, were not convinced since Kathy said she was sleeping for most of the time she said that Robert was with her. Homicide detectives focused on Robert, and the closer they looked into him, the more their suspicions grew. On the recorded call that Kathy made to police the day the bodies were found, she was heard frantically yelling in Cantonese. Her words were translated, and it was discovered that she was yelling at Robert. While Kathy was on the phone with police, Robert told her to wait for them at the scene while he went to pick up her parents. She was heard pleading with him not to leave her and said, "I'm more scared than you are." Robert left anyway and took the trip to her parents' house to pick them up, a trip that would take a half an hour each way, leaving his frantic wife behind at the scene of a brutal murder to wait for police alone without supposedly knowing whether or not the murderer was even still around. It also came to light that before Robert and Kathy entered the master bedroom, Robert told her not to look. This was before they discovered any of the bodies. This indicated that he probably knew what lay ahead and impulsively tried to minimize the trauma he was about to expose his wife to. This would also explain why all the victims were in clear view except for Kathy's brother Min, who was completely covered with a blanket. But police needed more evidence to make an arrest, and they'd eventually find it. While detectives gathered evidence to find a motive and build a case against Robert, a decision was made to secretly install pinhole cameras in his home to keep an eye on Brenda and make sure she was safe, since she was now living with the prime suspect in the mass murder they were investigating. Just days after the murders, Kathy and Robert had adopted Brenda and became her legal guardians. Since she was the sole survivor, her family's estate was passed down to her. However, because she was still underage, all of the family's assets, including her father's house, her grandparents' house, and the news agency, all fell under the control of her legal guardians, Robert and Kathy. Within a matter of weeks after the massacre, the news agency was back in business, and Kathy and Robert were now running it. This was the first time since his restaurant failed in 2005 that Robert wasn't unemployed. Not too long after that, Robert evicted Min's parents from the house that their own son had bought for them. Police also got their hands on some old photos of Robert, which showed him wearing the same exact pair of sneakers as the ones which left the footprints at the crime scene. They also captured him on camera, disposing of what they believed to be strong evidence against him. According to police, Robert ripped apart a cardboard shoebox belonging to a pair of his Asics sneakers and soaked them in this bucket of water so that he could flush them down the toilet. It was also noted by a detective that during his questioning, Robert told him that he and Kathy saw 5 bodies before they called police, when in fact, they hadn't yet found Min's body. He called back the detective months later to clarify that he meant to say 4 or 5 bodies. This clarification only made him more suspicious. All of the signs pointed to Robert as the killer, but police wanted more than circumstantial evidence and executed a search warrant at his house. In his garage, a dark stain was found on the floor. A sample of the stain was collected and sent to a forensics lab for testing. The results indicated that it contained the DNA of 4 out of the 5 murder victims with a high degree of certainty. On the morning of May 5, 2011, almost 2 years after the murders, Robert Z. was arrested on 5 counts of murder and was held without bond. But one question loomed on everyone's mind. What could have possibly compelled him to commit such a heinous act? Robert pleaded not guilty and denied any involvement in the murders. After 3 mistrials for various reasons and 5 years behind bars without a conviction, Robert was released with an ankle monitor as he awaited his next trial. His 4th trial commenced in June of 2016. The state alleged that Robert was in fact the murderer and laid out 3 motives for his egregious crimes. The first was his jealousy. While Robert was struggling to find work, Min was providing for his family, took care of his parents, and even supported Robert's wife. Prosecutors said that this led him to feel inferior and that he wasn't getting the respect that he believed he deserved from his in-laws. The second motive was his greed. It was alleged that Robert knew that if he took out the family and kept one of the children alive, they would be placed in his and Kathy's care, which meant that their inheritance would also be left under their control, and that turned out to be exactly how it played out. The third motive that the prosecution alleged was his perverted obsession with Brenda. Brenda testified that he assaulted her before and after the murders, and that the assaults became worse and more frequent after she moved into his home. The exact details of the assault were sealed by the court. Robert's defense argued that there was no evidence to back up any of these claims and that Robert wasn't the only person in Australia who owned that same pair of shoes in that size. They claimed that Robert didn't have the skills to carry out such an attack and murder 5 people, then escape without a scratch. They also said that he couldn't have had the opportunity to dispose of the murder weapon and highlighted the alibi his wife provided him. Prosecutors fired back and claimed that Robert likely drugged his wife before he left the house that night in order to keep her asleep. They also brought in another inmate, referred to as Witness A, to testify against Robert in exchange for a reduced sentence. The inmate testified that Robert told him that he committed the murders and used a hammer he had bought from a store that he knew had dummy surveillance cameras installed. He also claimed that Robert had told him he didn't believe he'd be tried, and that his plan B was to plant DNA from a dead man at a morgue at the scene of the crime or on the murder weapon. The trial lasted almost 8 months, and by January of 2017, the jury was not able to reach a unanimous decision. 11 jurors found Robert guilty, and 1 wasn't convinced that he was. The presiding judge accepted the majority verdict, and on January 12, 2017, Robert was found guilty of 5 counts of murder and was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. To this day, he continues to maintain his innocence and has appealed his conviction, but it was dismissed in 2021. Throughout the trial, Min's parents were visibly overwhelmed with grief over the tragic loss of their son and his wife, and their 2 young grandchildren whom they loved so dearly. Kathy continues to stand by her husband and has expressed to Brenda that she believes he was framed. Brenda said that she was overwhelmed with the amount of love and support by her school, who brought in busloads of students to her family's funeral, and her community, who showed up in large numbers to pay their respects and raise money for her trust fund. Brenda later gave an interview and recalled the last time she saw her father when he dropped her off at the airport for her school trip. She said, "To this day, my biggest regret was not hugging him and telling him I loved him, to say thank you for being an amazingly loving and caring parent." Her friends and her high school principal, who have helped her through her darkest times, continue to stay in close touch with her and meet with her regularly. Brenda now lives with her dog and continues to stay strong as she keeps her family in her thoughts and strives to be someone who she knows they would be proud of.